Welcome back to Zenith Poker. In this tutorial, we'll continue on with our study of the small blind versus big blind 2-bet pots. And today we'll be looking at some of the connected mid boards, specifically focusing on some of the flop play. So first off, as an overview of the connected mid, so we've got some of the queen high connected down to 9 high connected. And as we can see, the overview of the equity and the EVs show quite a strong preference for the higher connected boards compared to the lower connected boards. So we've got equity ranging from this 58.5 on the Queen Jack 10, and we'll look a little bit more Queen Jack 10 later, all the way down to 52.7 for the 965. So we'll dive into one of these boards in a bit. But first, we'll have a look at the overall sort of checking and betting frequencies. On the higher boards, we can see that the checking frequency is slightly lower compared to the lower boards. So at the lowest checking frequency, we've got the Queen Jack 10 and other Queen X boards. And some of the Jack X boards are sort of towards the middle, and the 9X and 10X boards have the highest checking frequency or the lowest betting frequency. The overall bet size is favored towards the smaller bets, with across this subset 30% betting frequency for the quarter pot bet size, and on certain boards that bet size is taken at a very high frequency. For example, here this Queen 10-9 betting 63%, Queen Jack 9 62%, etc. The next highest bet size. The next most frequent bet size is the half pot bet size, down on average at 10.3%. So we can see that sort of across these boards, a small bet is what's taken at a pretty high frequency, and then on certain boards you've got some of the bigger betting. We'll take a look at Queen Jack 10 just because it's a little bit special. On Queen Jack 10, this connected board is a little bit different from the other ones, specifically because the small blind has all of the ace king when the big blind has none of the ace king. So that means this particular straight, the ace king, being having full combos of that in the small blinds range really will affect the strategy for both players. Of course, there's two other straights. There's the king 9 straight and the 9-8 straight. Both players having many combinations of each of those, but the ace king straight being the absolute nuts at this stage really affects the strategies for both players. And if we look at the range of bet sizes, we've got the pot size bet all the way down to the quarter pot bet, and the betting frequency is very, very high. So we'll have a look at the range construction for this 3/4 pot bet, and we can see that there's a lot of straights in this 3/4 pot bet. 17.5% compared to the overall frequency of straights at 11.1%. If we look quickly at the checking line, we can see the big blind only has 5.77% straights. So that difference in straights really comes from this this ace king and the presence of the king 9 and the 9-8. So a lot of those really hit this board. So the ace king being in particular the one with the most impact on both players' strategies. Ace king being taken into a lot of different lines, but you can see that taking this 3/4 pot bet or half pot bet to start off with ace king is really what's going to happen. So ace king very, very heavy in this 3/4 pot line, 3/4 pot call brick, for example, and then ace king just now betting twice the pot on the turn, really starting to polarize on the brick turn, and then getting the money in on basically every river, even the ones that sort of complete that flush. Slight difference, of course, if the flush comes in on the turn, then because there's a lot of flush draws for the big blind, that'll affect the turn betting range construction. But we'll talk a bit more about sort of the different turns and river lines in a later video. So yep. So the king queen, sorry, the queen jack 10, one of the special connected mid boards specifically because of that ace king. We'll take a look at some of the other ones. We can focus on a bit about the other queen high boards. Other queen high boards. So for example, this queen turn 8 with a flush draw. All these queen high ones betting relatively small for this quarter pot bet size. Overall equity 56.75%. Here on the queen 10-8, the only straight is the jack 9. There's not a lot of straights for each player. 2.1% for the big blind and 2.2% for the small blinds. There's not a huge amount of them. So really what's going on is this small bet size is sort of quite prevalent in sort of top pair. And you've got this small betting to try and deny equity from certain hands, such as gut shots, getting value from some weaker pairs, and trying to avoid running your top pair, middle pair hands into stronger hands such as two pair and straights. So there's still quite a lot of checking, and then a lot of that checking goes for a sort of check call or a check raise, depending on the bet size the opponent uses. But a lot of it goes for check call, mainly because the big blind here is making a lot of bigger bets into the small blind, and also checking back a lot. So because there's so much equity for in kind of relatively marginal hands for both players, like there's a lot of hands on this board that that'll make a pair and a straight draw, a pair and a backdoor flush draw, flush draws, gut shots. Loads of these kinds of hands will hit this board, and so there's a lot of equity to deny. So there's still a substantial checking range. Betting quarter pot will try to sort of deny a little bit of equity from the big blind, but the big blind is just going to have a lot of raises. And then for the stronger hands out of the small blind is going to be a whole bunch of 3-bets. So a lot of what's going on here is that the small blind is either trying to draw or trying to deny a little bit of equity from the big blind, but it's really on the big blind to prevent the small blind from seeing the turn. And the way that the big blind does that is by raising or betting when the small blind checks to them. We'll take a look quickly at another sort of similar board just to hammer that in. Queen Jack 8. So Queen Jack 8 here the straight is a 10-9. Kind of similar to the previous board. A lot of betting small and then sort of 3-betting. And there's a lot of equity to be denied for the small blind and the big blind respectively. Big blind is going to check back, and a lot of those check backs with sort of this 2 undercard type hands really aren't going to be able to catch up. So the small blind doesn't really have to worry about denying equity from sort of these hands which just have 2 undercards. And sort of this small bet, even quarter pot bet, getting the big blind to slightly overfold. In the later lines, in sort of the check down line, there'll be spots where the big blind basically just has to give up a lot, or the small blind will be able to make a bet of some kind, and the big blind will have to overfold. So there's no real need to worry too much about the big blind having a hand with 2 undercards without any other kind of draw. On the other hand, the big blind has to worry about the small blinds, all the small blinds hands, because basically all the small blinds hands will have some kind of equity on this board. The very weakest hands obviously not, but a large chunk of the small blinds range will have some kind of equity that will be able to draw and catch up to the big blinds hands. So for that reason, the big blind will be trying to bet fairly polar and trying to deny equity from some of those draws and one pair type hands, which the small blind will have quite a few of those here. So the small blind checking relatively merged range. You can see there's a lot of top pair, middle pairs, and some of these weaker pairs. So it's a very pair heavy range which checks, and then some very strong hands such as straights and sets will check to go for either check raise on this street or a later street. And of course, there's also a wide variety of draws that the small blind will be checking. Fairly mixed throughout. The stronger hands, such as top pair, and stronger, will bet at a slightly higher frequency than they will check. But checking is still quite prevalent. And you will see in a lot of these boards that if the small blind checks, the big blind will bet a fairly big size. So kind of on average, the bigger the 3/4 pot and the pot size bet is taken pretty often after the small blind checks. So quite big and polar into kind of the small blinds merged and relatively draw heavy range. It's draw heavy in the sense that the small blind will have sort of pair plus draw equity with a lot of their hands. So let's go down and look at some other boards. So if we move on to, say, for example, Jack 10-7. Here, Jack 10-7, the 9-8 is the straight. And there is some slight differences between the number of straights that are on the board. So we'll quickly compare Jack 10-7 and Jack 10-8. Jack 10-7, the 9-8 is a straight, versus Jack 10-8. You've got two different combinations of straight, the Queen 9 and the 9-7. And general, the more straights that there are, the more checking the small blind will do. Just because the big blind will have some stronger hands to defend with rather than just these sort of middle pairs. But here on Jack 10-7, there is a small equity edge for the small blind. And of course, there's a lot of these undercard type hands which are going to check and then pretty much just give up. So all these ace highs are just checking to give up, or if it goes check, maybe they can draw to an ace, something like that. So there is still a lot of draw equity on boards like this. But the small blind now is starting to bet into the big blind's kind of merged range merged in the sense that they've got a lot of one pair type hands on this kind of board. The 7 in particular hits the big blinds, the bottom of the big blinds calling range preflop. So they'll have a fair amount of 7x. So say, for example, the small blind's going to bet half pot. A lot of these weaker pairs here, these 7x hands will basically always call, and then the weaker pocket pairs will be indifferent between calling and folding, and none of the ace highs are really calling unless I've got some kind of stroke draw. So this half pot bet on the flop, and then this quarter pot bet on the flop really helps with sort of the equity denial component of the range, and also getting value from the weaker pairs within the range. So small blind having a lot of over pairs, queens through aces, and then decent top pairs and two pairs, ace jack, ace 10 type hands will all want to get a little bit of value from the 7x component of the big blind's range, which is fairly merged at this stage. But in comparison, on Jack 10-8, the 8 slightly hits the small blind range slightly more than the big blind's range. But on the other hand, the big blind's going to have quite a few straights having both Queen 9 offsuit and 9-7 offsuit at some frequency. Here I put 9-7 offsuit 2.8%, but definitely all the 9-7 suited, a large component of the Queen 9 offsuit. So for that reason, the small blind's got 3.8% straights here, and that's enough to really prevent the small blind from betting too frequently, because a lot of the straights would just, especially the Queen 9, will just raise, and there won't be a lot for the small blind to do. So there is still an equity denial component with this small sort of blocking type bet, but a lot of the time the small blind here will have a hand that's kind of fairly merged, and then the big blind will want to be polarizing against that. So quite frequently it'll go sort of check, and then after it goes check, the small blind will probe on the turn to try and get value from their hands, such as the overpairs. But initially starting off on this kind of board where there's two straights, the big blind having more of the straights, the small blind will check and then play relatively defensively, and then in position the big blind will bet a lot of their they're strong hands, and so when it checks through, the small blind can then start to polarize against the big blind's relatively merged check back range. And of course, the small blind still has a lot of draws that they're going to want to be checking to try and outdraw the big blind's hands. So it was a combination of those two. The EV of a lot of these hands, in terms of their checking EV, will be higher on certain boards. So, say for example, pocket queens. If it checks through any kind of brick, the EV of queens goes really high, and so the queens will want to be betting big on a lot of those turns and rivers. But in contrast, for example, a hand like 9A, which is sort of bottom pair with an open ender, the EV will be a lot higher when their straight completes, obviously. So it's a combination of those two. Some of the weaker hands will have stronger EV on certain boards, and some of the stronger hands at this stage will have stronger EV on certain turns, and the stronger hands at this stage will have very high EV on different turns. So relatively brick turns, you've got some strong hands, and then on kind of the turns which complete for both players, you've also got some strong hands. So it's important to cover both of them. So there's a bit of the contrast between the Jack 10-7, Jack 10-8, keeping really close eye on the number of stroke combinations for both players, especially in kind of these middling board types. So here, for example, here for example the Jack 9-7 and sort of the Jack 9-8. Right, Jack 9-7 only having the 10-8 as a straight versus Jack 9-8 having Queen 10 and 10-7 as the straight. Really quite a big difference between the betting and checking strategies for both players there. So we won't dive into that. We'll focus more on some of these 10x boards. So here we'll look at sort of this 10-9, 10-9-6, and then we'll probably compare that to the 10-8-7. So here, 10-9-6, where's the straight? The straight is at the 8-7. 8-7 offsuit. We'll have a look at 8-7 offsuit. Relatively high frequencies for the small blind, basically full frequencies for the big blind. 3.0% versus 2.4% straight. So there's still quite a decent amount of straights for the big blind here. But because there's only the one combination versus the two combinations in that particular straight, is low and can get relatively outdrawn by other kinds of straight combinations. There is slightly more betting here for the small blind. The small blind will have a lot of hands that will want to bet at a pretty high frequency. So pocket jacks, pocket queens, will want to bet to try and deny equity from the big blind's hands. Even if it's making a relatively small bet, such as quarter pot, half pot. But in contrast, when the small blind checks, the big blind is going to be betting a fairly polar range for a relatively big size, a 3/4 pot, and pot size bet, as we've seen on the previous boards as well. So a lot of these lines will center around who has the straight, who has the sets, and all those straights and sets will be betting fairly big on the flop for the big blind, but in contrast, the small blind is going to be betting small with a lot of these top pairs and overpair hands to deny equity. And then once the big blind just calls, if there's a relative brick, the expectation for some of these overpairs goes really high on the turn, and so the big blind having a relatively merged range at this stage after Crits calling the bet and having all the draws miss, the small blind will quite happily bet sort of bigs in terms of like pot size bet, or even bigger on all of these turns to then get their value. On the other hand, if the small blind bets small and then gets raised, a lot of those hands will end up playing defensively. A lot of those overpairs will end up playing relatively defensively on the turn here. So say for example, bet small, get raised, pocket jacks, pocket queens, pocket kings, pocket aces, all of them are calling at a pretty high frequency. And then the hands which go for the 3-bet are the straights and sort of the bottom set for value or sort of merge value. And then all of the straights will jam it in and then get basically called by the sets and straights and combo draws. So yeah. Now going on to some of the 9 high boards. Conscious of time. Say for example, 9-8-5. Once again, going down to 9-8-5. 9-8-5 will be hitting the weaker kind of preflop hands out of the big blinds range. Sort of these suited these weaker suited gapped hands and offsuit connected hands will be making a lot of pairs on 9-8-5. And so because of that, the overall equity for the small blind is a little bit lower. There is still a fair amount of equity to deny. Pocket tens, pocket jacks do want to bet small, do want to bet here to deny equity, but we'll often go for a check raise as well, or check call now and sort of check raise at turn. A lot of the small blind will be checking a lot of their range, or will be betting small, and there's going to be a fair few more give ups in the small blinds range. A lot of these two overcard hands without any additional draw equity will basically be giving up. So say for example, all of this king queen without any backdoors, king jack, etc. Will be checking and folding to this flop bet. And then if it sort of checks through, then and those hands hit, that's great for them. And then we'll start to sort of lead the turn. After the small blind checks, the big blind will be betting a lot of their straights and sets. The main straight here being the 10-7 straight, but there's also the sorry, not the 10-7, the 7-6 straight. So with the 7-6 straight, the big blind will be betting a lot of them into there, and sort of the small blind will go for that check raise. But a lot of the play will happen in sort of this check line. Okay, so I'll leave it there. So that's a little bit of an overview of the sort of flop strategy in general. The higher the board, the more the small blind will be betting, and the lower the board, the more the small blind will be checking. When the small blind bets, they'll usually be betting for a relatively small size. Both players should be mindful of the number of the straights that are in both players' ranges. The more straights there are, in general, that the small blind will be checking slightly more or betting a relatively smaller size. And then the big blind after the small blind checks will usually be betting sort of a 3/4 pot or pot size bet, kind of bet size, with some of the half pot being thrown in on certain boards, depending on what those board types are. So say for example, with the 975, 986, a lot of these very low boards can be at sort of this half pot to try and deny equity, and betting with slightly wider range, but on certain board types, betting bigger with a relatively polar range and checking back at a pretty high frequency. So understanding kind of the subtleties of the flop betting strategy will help you out, but understanding that in general the small blind will be betting a small size and the big blind will be relatively polar after small blind checks, and then the big blind will be betting a relatively polar range, and then after it checks through, the small blind could start to polarize, and we'll have sort of the overpairs in their range to help them with that polarity in terms of the turn probe. So in the next video, we'll focus a little bit more on sort of the check line and the turn probes for the small blind, because that'll be relatively important, and we'll be focusing on some of the different turn cards in that check line, and how both players will be playing those different turn cards. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye now.